On April 22, 1956, in the early hours of a damp morning on the outskirts of East Berlin, a team of Soviet soldiers and East German technicians began excavating the waterlogged soil of the Altklinik Municipal Cemetery. Spring had been exceptionally rainy that year, causing widespread short circuits in Berlin's telephone network. The official mission was to unearth a buried telephone cable and check for damage caused by excessive moisture. The soldiers dug methodically, following infrastructure maps provided by the Ministry of Communications of the German Democratic Republic. When they finally reached the cable at 2 meters depth, they found something that appeared on no map. The cable had been intercepted, tapped, and diverted into a secret tunnel extending toward the American sector. The immediate discovery triggered a security alarm that rapidly ascended the Soviet chain of command to Moscow. Within hours, KGB officers arrived at the site, followed by teams of military engineers and counterintelligence specialists. What they found was one of the most audacious espionage operations of the Cold War, a 450-meter tunnel excavated beneath the border between West and East Berlin, equipped with sophisticated listening technology capable of simultaneously monitoring hundreds of Soviet communication lines. It was the physical manifestation of a security nightmare that Soviet military planners had considered impossible. Soviet arrogance about the security of their buried communications in East Berlin had deep roots in the military engineering doctrine of the Red Army itself. After capturing Berlin in May 1945, Soviet communications engineers had transformed the destroyed German capital into the nerve center of a vast network connecting Moscow to all Warsaw Pact forces in Europe. Telephone and telegraph lines extended from Paris to the Urals, from Copenhagen to Bucharest, all converging on Berlin. During the division of the city into occupation sectors, the Soviets secured control over the main communication nodes, installing deep underground cables specifically to prevent interception. KGB security doctrine considered that cables buried at depths of 2 to 3 meters, in territory totally controlled by Soviet and East German forces, were absolutely protected against any Western access attempts. Technical reports from the GRU from 1952 and 1953 categorically stated that underground communications in East Berlin were invulnerable to enemy interception due to installation depth and absolute territorial control. This confidence was reinforced by Berlin's political geography. Any excavation attempt from the western sector would have to traverse hundreds of meters of hostile territory, under constant surveillance by border patrols, observation towers, and a massive military presence. Soviet planners simply could not conceive of an engineering operation of this magnitude being executed in secret, meters from their own military installations. While the Soviets trusted in the geographic and technical impenetrability of their communications, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service had been developing an operational capability that would challenge precisely that assumption. The operations architect was William King Harvey, CIA station chief in Berlin since 1952, a counterintelligence veteran known for his intense personality and unconventional methods. Harvey had meticulously studied the successful Operation Silver in Vienna, where the British CIS had intercepted Soviet communications through tunnels between 1948 and 1952. He realized that Berlin offered an even greater opportunity. While Vienna had regional importance, Berlin was the central node of the entire Soviet military communications network in Europe. In 1953, Harvey presented the operations concept in London, in joint CIA-CIS meetings that included signals specialists, engineers, and intelligence analysts. The plan was technically audacious. Excavate a tunnel of approximately 450 meters starting from the American sector, crossing under the border and reaching a specific point in Altklinik, where 3 main Soviet communication cables converged at just 2 meters depth. Detailed maps obtained from intelligence sources showed the exact location of the cables, including lines that connected the headquarters of the group of Soviet forces in Germany at Wunstorf with Moscow, Warsaw, and other Eastern Bloc capitals. In January 1954, CIA Director Alan Dulles formally approved the operation, codenamed Operation Gold for the Americans and Operation Stopwatch for the British. The budget was estimated at $6,800,000, an extraordinary sum for intelligence operations at the time, reflecting the project's ambition and technical complexity. To establish cover, the United States Air Force officially constructed a new radar station in Rudo, in the American sector of Berlin, adjacent to the border with the Soviet sector. The site, surrounded by high security fences and guarded by American military personnel, was approximately the size of an urban block. At the center of the complex, a large industrial-looking warehouse was erected that supposedly housed radar equipment and support facilities. In reality, the building was designed with a special basement storage area to contain the 3,100 tons of soil that would be removed during the tunnel excavation. The engineering of this camouflage operation was meticulous. The excavated soil had to disappear without leaving visible traces, without trucks removing suspicious earth, without mountains of material accumulating on site. Each cubic meter of Berlin earth had to be compacted and stored within the complex itself, effectively creating a second underground basement. Excavation began in September 1954, using civil engineering techniques adapted for clandestine operations. Berlin's soil was predominantly sandy, presenting high risk of collapse during drilling. To prevent catastrophic cave-ins, American engineers developed an advanced drilling shield system, a mobile steel structure that protected workers while excavating, being pushed forward by hydraulic jacks as the tunnel progressed. Behind the shield, sections of heavy steel lining were installed, forming rings of approximately 6 feet in diameter when bolted together. Each ring was composed of 5 heavy steel plates, and the complete tunnel construction consumed 125 tons of steel plates. The work was performed 24 hours a day in rotating shifts under claustrophobic and dangerous conditions. The tunnel had to descend first, reaching safe depth to pass under the border, then gradually ascend to the cable interception point in Soviet territory. Precision was critical. Deviations of more than a few meters would make reaching the target impossible. Underground navigation equipment was used to maintain correct course, technology then available only for classified military operations. During 8 months of continuous work, the excavators systematically removed the equivalent of 20 average American living rooms in volume of earth, all stored in concrete compartments beneath the cover warehouse. In February 1955, the excavators reached the calculated point beneath Altglienic Cemetery, directly below Soviet communication cables. The next phase was even more delicate, breaking through vertically to the cables without causing detectable vibrations on the surface, accessing the cables without interrupting service, and installing taps without leaving identifiable electrical signatures. British SIS technicians were responsible for this critical stage, bringing expertise developed in Operation Silver in Vienna. They utilized custom amplifiers, non-invasive tap equipment, and multi-track recording systems capable of simultaneously monitoring up to 500 individual connections. The intercepted cables carried 3 distinct types of traffic: unencrypted voice telephone lines used for administrative and logistical communications, telegraph lines with encrypted messages between high-level military commands, and teletype circuits transmitting continuous operational data. Installation of the taps was completed in May 1955, and on May 11 at 11:45 p.m. local time, the interception system was activated. Immediately, conversations in Russian and German began flowing through recorders installed in the listening chamber on the American side of the tunnel. In the first 24 hours of operation, more than 100 telephone conversations and thousands of teletype messages were captured, covering topics from troop movements to complaints about supply shortages at distant military bases. In the following months, Operation Gold became the CIA's most productive technical intelligence source in Europe. The capability to monitor Soviet communications in real time, without filters or delays, provided American and British analysts with unprecedented insight into Soviet military operations, capabilities, and intentions. The intercepts revealed the complete order of battle of Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces in Central Europe, including unit designations, locations, readiness levels, and operational deficiencies. Conversations between Soviet officers exposed significant tensions between Russian commanders and East German subordinates, revealing resentment about unequal treatment and mutual distrust. Reports about the deplorable condition of East German railways provided critical information about logistical limitations that would affect any Soviet military mobilization westward. Intercepts of discussions about atomic energy projects allowed Western intelligence to identify names of scientists and engineers working in sensitive nuclear facilities. Perhaps most strategically important, the complete absence of operational planning for invasion of Western Europe in the intercepted communications provided NATO planners crucial assurance that the Soviets were not preparing an imminent attack, reducing the risk of catastrophic misunderstandings during high-tension periods of the Cold War. At the operation's peak, technicians and analysts continuously monitored 121 simultaneous voice circuits, processing approximately 1,200 hours of telephone conversations per day. The recorders consumed 50 reels of magnetic tape daily, each reel capable of recording continuous hours of multiple channels. The raw material was discreetly transported to processing centers in London and Washington, where teams of translators fluent in Russian and German worked in shifts to transcribe, analyze, and disseminate the extracted intelligence. The volume was overwhelming. By the end of just 6 months of operation, the operation had accumulated 25,000 tape reels, containing millions of individual conversations. Each transcription was cataloged, indexed, and correlated with other intelligence sources to build a comprehensive picture of Soviet operations. Intelligence reports derived from the Berlin Tunnel intercepts began influencing high-level assessments for President Eisenhower, informing decisions about American military force allocation, diplomatic negotiations, and Cold War containment strategy. For CIA analysts, the tunnel had become a gold mine of strategic intelligence, operating continuously without any indication that the Soviets suspected its existence. What the American and British operators did not know, and what would make Operation Gold one of the most paradoxical episodes of the Cold War, was that the Soviets had known about the tunnel's existence from the beginning. In December 1953, even before formal approval of the operation by Allen Dulles, the plan had been betrayed to the Soviets by George Blake, a British CIS officer who participated in preliminary planning meetings in London. Blake was a KGB double agent, codenamed Diarmid, recruited in 1951 after his capture and indoctrination during the Korean War. In the weeks following the planning meetings, Blake provided his KGB handlers with detailed descriptions of the operational concept, the tunnel's approximate location, the target cables, the construction timeline, and intelligence objectives. The information was transmitted to Moscow through highly compartmented KGB communication channels, accessible only to the highest echelons of Soviet intelligence. The KGB's initial reaction was alarm, followed by a remarkable strategic decision: allow the operation to proceed. The KGB leadership's calculations were cold and pragmatic. George Blake was considered one of the most valuable penetration agents the Soviets possessed in the Western intelligence apparatus. He had access to British and American espionage operations throughout Europe, had knowledge of Western agent identities operating in the Eastern Bloc, and his position promised access to even more critical secrets in the future. Exposing Blake by prematurely interrupting the tunnel would mean losing this invaluable source to save tactical and operational level communications. The decision to protect Blake created an extraordinarily complex intelligence situation. The KGB had to allow the operation to proceed without alerting other Soviet agencies or the East Germans, any of whom could discover the tunnel through independent means and inadvertently compromise Blake. The KGB's own high-level communications were transmitted through separate overhead lines, impossible to intercept without immediate detection, and therefore were not at risk. But the lines intercepted by the tunnel carried communications from the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, the command of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, and the Stasi, East German Intelligence. The KGB deliberately did not inform these organizations about the tunnel's existence, keeping them ignorant of the interception to preserve Blake's cover. This compartmentation meant that thousands of Soviet and East German officers continued using the compromised lines for routine communications, completely unaware that every word was being recorded and analyzed by American and British analysts. Counterintelligence studies conducted years later confirmed that the KGB did not attempt to feed false information through the intercepted lines, a remarkable decision that reflected both the KGB's confidence in the genuine ignorance of other agencies and the calculation that poorly executed disinformation could alert the West and still compromise Blake. Throughout all of 1955, the situation remained in a precarious and surreal balance. In the tunnel beneath Berlin, American and British technicians meticulously monitored communications that the KGB knew were being intercepted, while GRU officers and Soviet military commanders continued using the same lines without the slightest suspicion. In London, George Blake continued his career in CIS, participating in operations against Soviet targets while simultaneously informing the KGB about these same operations. In Moscow, KGB leadership carefully monitored the situation, waiting for the right moment to terminate the operation in a way that would protect their penetration source. The quantity of genuine intelligence flowing to Washington and London continued growing astronomically. By the end of 1955, Operation Gold had recorded 30,000 tape reels, processed 300,000 transcribed conversations, and produced more than 1,000 intelligence reports disseminated to policymakers and Allied military commanders. For the CIA, the tunnel represented the triumph of American technical ingenuity over Soviet security. For the KGB, it represented a calculated sacrifice of mid-level information to protect a human intelligence source of incomparable strategic value. Neither side fully understood the irony of their situation. Resolution came in April 1956, when the KGB decided that the risk of accidental tunnel exposure by third parties had become unacceptably high, and that Blake was sufficiently protected to allow a staged discovery. The heavy rains of spring 1956 provided the perfect pretext. Actual failures in East Berlin telephone lines created plausible justification for maintenance crews to excavate along cable routes. On the morning of April 22, Soviet and East German technicians were directed specifically to the location in Altglienicke where cables had been tapped. The discovery was carefully orchestrated to appear accidental, preserving Blake's operational security. In the following hours, Soviet and East German media received carefully controlled access to the site, and the discovery was transformed into a propaganda opportunity against American imperialism and Western espionage provocations. Soviet expectation was that revelation of the operation would generate international outrage against the United States, damage American prestige in Europe, and strengthen Soviet narratives about Western aggression. Journalists were conducted through the tunnel photographed interception equipment, and TASS issued statements denouncing the violation of East German sovereignty. The Soviet propaganda campaign, however, failed spectacularly. Instead of condemning the American operation, Western and even neutral press coverage marveled at Operation Gold's technical audacity and ingenuity. Reports in European and American newspapers emphasized the engineering feat of excavating a 450-meter tunnel under hostile territory, the operational risk assumed by the agents involved, and the sophistication of the installed interception systems. Public reaction transformed what should have been an American embarrassment into a demonstration of Western technical superiority and determination. Editorials commented that the operation demonstrated that American intelligence services could overcome obstacles considered impossible, penetrating Soviet defenses through creativity and superior technology. For Soviet leadership in Moscow, the international response was disconcerting and frustrating. Instead of strengthening their position, the tunnel's discovery had inadvertently reinforced perceptions of American competence and Soviet vulnerability. What was planned as a propaganda victory transformed into another demonstration of Western capability to challenge and penetrate the Soviet security system. Internal reaction within the CIA and CIS to the tunnel's discovery was initially disappointment, but quickly transformed into strategic reassessment. The operation had lasted almost one full year, from May 1955 to April 1956, more than enough time to accumulate an extraordinary quantity of intelligence. Processing and analysis of captured material continued for more than 2 years after the tunnel's closure, with teams of translators working systematically through the 50,000 tape reels accumulated. The final count of collected intelligence was impressive even by massive operation standards. 443,000 completely transcribed telephone conversations, 40,000 hours of voice telephone intercepts, 6 million hours of recorded teletype traffic, and 1,750 intelligence reports disseminated to consumers in American and British governments. Subsequent analyses determined that the intelligence was genuine, without evidence of systematic disinformation or intentional feeding of false information through the intercepted lines. This finding was remarkable. Even knowing about the tunnel's existence, the KGB had chosen to sacrifice the authenticity of other Soviet agencies' communications to preserve George Blake's cover. Full revelation of Blake's betrayal did not come until years later. In 1961, a Polish intelligence defector provided information that led to Blake's identification as a Soviet agent. He was arrested in London, tried in secret, and sentenced to 42 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed by a British court for espionage. During the trial, the full scope of Blake's betrayals was exposed. He had compromised not only Operation Gold, but dozens of other British and American operations in Europe. Testimony indicated that Blake had betrayed identities of approximately 40 Western agents operating in the Eastern Bloc, many of whom were subsequently arrested, interrogated, and executed by Soviet authorities. The damage Blake caused to Western intelligence operations in Eastern Europe was devastating and took years to repair. In 1966, in an episode that added another layer of irony to the saga, Blake escaped from Wormhood Scrubb's high-security prison in London with help from sympathizers and fled to Moscow, where he was received as a hero, received KGB decoration, and lived the rest of his life on Soviet state pension. He died in Moscow in December 2020 at 98 years old, never having expressed regret for his actions. Final assessment of Operation Gold by the Western intelligence community remained positive despite Blake's betrayal. Strategic analyses concluded that the operation was a significant success for the following reasons. First, the quantity and quality of collected intelligence provided critical information about Soviet military capabilities, strategic intentions, and operational vulnerabilities that could not have been obtained by other means in that pre-satellite period of the Cold War. Second, the KGB's decision to allow the operation, even knowing its existence, validated the authenticity of collected intelligence, since the KGB evidently judged that protecting Blake was worth more than preventing interception of tactical-level communications. Third, the operation demonstrated American technical capabilities that had psychological effect on adversaries, establishing that no Soviet communication system, however protected it seemed, was genuinely secure against Western penetration. Fourth, even with Blake's betrayal, the compartmentation imposed by the KGB meant that vast portions of the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus remained unaware of the interception, continuing to use compromised channels and providing genuine intelligence. Fifth, the technical and operational lessons from Operation Gold informed subsequent signals intelligence operations, contributing to the development of increasingly sophisticated interception capabilities in following decades. The strategic legacy of Operation Gold extended far beyond the specific intercepts collected between 1955 and 1956. The operation established precedents for CIA-ISIS intelligence cooperation that became models for future Anglo-American joint operations. It demonstrated that large-scale technical operations could be executed in extremely hostile operational environments through combination of creative engineering, meticulous planning, and rigorous operational security. It validated investments in signals intelligence capabilities during an era when traditional human collection was becoming increasingly difficult in totalitarian police states. And it provided Western leaders with critical confidence during dangerous years of the Cold War that they genuinely understood Soviet capabilities and intentions, reducing risks of catastrophic misunderstandings based on ignorance or misperceptions. For the Soviet Union, Operation Gold represented both a defeat and a victory. A defeat insofar as their communications were penetrated and exploited for almost a year, but a victory in the sense that successful protection of George Blake allowed him to continue causing enormous damage to Western operations for additional years. The final paradox was that both sides considered the operation a success, for completely different and mutually exclusive reasons. Decades later, with the Cold War's end and the opening of both Western and Soviet archives, historians could reconstruct the complete story of Operation Gold with clarity impossible during the years of secrecy. Declassified CIA documents revealed technical details of tunnel construction, installation of interception systems, and massive processing of collected intelligence. KGB archives released after the Soviet Union's collapse confirmed Blake's role, the deliberate decision to allow the operation to continue, and Soviet frustration with the propaganda campaign's failure after the tunnel's discovery. Interviews with surviving participants, both Western and Soviet, added personal perspectives on an operation that few completely understood while it was in progress. The historical consensus that emerged was that Operation Gold represented one of the most notable examples of the complexity and irony of intelligence warfare during the Cold War. An operation simultaneously compromised from its conception and spectacularly successful in its objectives, betrayed by a double agent but producing genuine intelligence, discovered through careful staging but resulting in propaganda triumph for the victim instead of the discoverer. It was an operation where all sides knew parts of the truth, but nobody understood the complete picture until long after the final curtain had fallen on that particular chapter of Cold War espionage history.